Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on practical considerations for conducting culturally responsive assessments in schools. Your presenter today is Ashley Coombs. Before I introduce Ashley, I want to go over a few key reminders. Today's presentation will run up until 2:45, 2:50. We will have a question and answer session about 5 to 10 minutes at the end. So if you have anything you would like to submit for the Q&A session, please feel free to use the chat box or wait till the end. Please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole webinar. And if you're comfortable, you are free to turn on your video. As I mentioned, your presenter today is Ashley Coombs. Ashley is a fourth-year school psychology student at the University of Utah and is currently an intern school psychologist in a local school district, finishing up her final year in the EDS program. During her time at the University of Utah, she served on the Graduate Student Diversity Council Executive Board and the School Psychology's program's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. She is passionate about working with culturally diverse populations and is excited to return to this webinar series after piloting it last year. Welcome back, Ashley. It's such an honor to have you back here presenting for the DEI webinar series. We're super excited to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Annie. I am so excited to be back. As I go ahead and pull up my presentation screen here really quickly. And I am also glad that this is kind of a smaller group because I am by no means an expert on this topic. And so if you have questions or you have comments or would like to share situations that you've come across that you're like, hey, this is an awesome case that I've learned from, or hey, this is a case I have right now that I'm a little confused about, let's chat about it. I think that kind of collaboration is such a great way to learn and has been so beneficial to me throughout my training process and thus far. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So we'll be talking about practical considerations for conducting culturally responsive assessments in schools. And so I decided that I wanted to talk about this topic specifically because I feel like I got a really awesome training experience in my program on conducting multicultural assessments. However, they presented very much the ideal type of assessment that I would love every case to look like. And unfortunately, in public schools, that is not always the case. And I would argue in most cases is not at all. And so I have really been struggling this year with myself in that how do I make sure that I am conducting equitable assessments? How do I make sure that I am providing the kind of services to these students that they deserve and that they are entitled to, while also recognizing that resources can be really limited. And there are other, considerations that make this a little bit more complicated than my bright-eyed, bushy-tailed grad student self thought it would be. So let's jump in. So kind of generally, I am practicing here in Utah, so I will likely stay here for the next few years for sure, at least. And so I want to talk about Utah school demographics specifically, but this is pretty applicable as I was looking through nationwide statistics as well. Just for sake of time, we'll really focus on what it looks like here in Utah. Also, we'll be talking about barriers to equitable assessment. What are the things that are getting in our way? What are some of those factors that I was mentioning earlier that make it difficult to conduct the ideal assessment every single time? And then lastly, we'll be talking about testing and interpretation considerations. So again, feel free to jump in the chat with any questions. I would love to chat throughout if you have things that come up. So with that, let's talk about Utah student populations. So looking at most recent fall enrollment data from the Utah State Board of Education. So this is this current school year. So our state total, 674,650 students. We've got a lot here. And of those students, 29% are ethnic or racial and ethnic minority students. So a good chunk. There are some districts obviously that are much more diverse than others, but we are still seeing yearly increases in the number of students who fit this category in some capacity. So those are Asian students, Pacific Islander students, Hispanic Latino students, Black students, Native American students, all of those. We're seeing those increase year by year. So if we were to compare this to previous years, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we are just seeing a steady incline. And as that incline continues, we need to be sure that we are aware of and taking this really into consideration for our students. So of our students as well, 9% of our students have been identified as English language learners here in Utah. So this is a nice little map provided by WIDA. So we'll talk about WIDA a little bit later. This is 2014 data, but I'll tell you, I looked up 2021 data. It's changed by about 1%. So this is showing us the percentage of students who are identified as ELL students and also identified in as students with disabilities or in special education. So Utah right here, we're at 11%. And what we would expect here is for the percentage of our student population who have been identified as English language learners to be mirrored in a similar proportion within special education. So we're not too far off, but we're still, I think this current number with 2021 data is 10%, but we're still off in that we're overrepresenting students who are English language learners in special education. And you might think, oh, 1% is not bad at all. Sure, it could be much worse, but that 1% of our student population is still nearly 7,000 students. So we are currently overrepresenting these students in special education. So let's talk about some of these barriers to equitable assessment. First of all, there's a shortage of school psychologists, right? We hear this all the time. We know it very well once we're getting out into the field and we are bombarded with so many cases, and the ratios of psychologists to students is ridiculous. And so that is something that we're all aware of. There's a shortage of school psychologists. Because of that, we have very large caseloads typically. But on top of just a shortage of school psychologists in general, we also have a very significant shortage of bilingual school psychologists. So psychologists who are qualified and competent in administering some of these bilingual assessments that can provide really essential information for us when we are assessing culturally diverse students, English language learners, and the like. So like I mentioned, this results in really big caseloads. And so when we're on a timeline, a really specific timeline to get these assessments done, meet all of our legal obligations, it can be really easy to cut corners. It can be really easy to say, you know, that's good enough, especially when it comes to culturally diverse students, English language learners. Additionally, there is a general lack of training in multicultural assessment. Again, I was very fortunate and very glad in our program here at the University of Utah that we do really specifically have a practicum experience in this area, a course in this area, but there are a lot of programs that don't do that. And even then, it is very much a topic that we could have several courses on, right? And so generally, there can be a lack of training in multicultural assessment. Additionally, when we're in schools, I am not my own island, right? I am consistently collaborating with other professionals, with speech language pathologists, with our special education teacher, with our occupational therapist, with our general education teachers. And so across the board in education training programs, regardless of what area we're looking at, there is a lack of training in just multicultural issues in general. And so while I, again, am not an island, I'm interacting with these people and assessing with an interdisciplinary team, we have to be aware of our own lack of training and our own biases, but also how we can recognize and support others as well. And then finally, an inadequate cultural awareness in the interpretation of assessment results. So now that I've done all my testing, how do I interpret this from a culturally responsive lens? So These are some really common barriers that are coming up when we are assessing culturally diverse students in schools. So some considerations for assessment that really should be bare minimum when we are assessing diverse students. 1, environmental factors. 2, cultural factors, and we'll dive into these each a little bit more specifically. Next, language proficiency, language dominance, and the difference between those two things, appropriate assessment batteries, and again, how do we interpret these results? So looking at cultural and environmental factors. First of all, socioeconomic status. That is impacting students in a big way for a variety of reasons, right? Access to resources. We saw this highlighted, these inequities highlighted very poignantly during the height of the pandemic when these schools were shutting down right there at the beginning in 2020, 2021. Where we were moving to online learning, students were going home, and we saw these situations where parents who were forced to work 2 jobs and now children who were forced to be caregivers for their younger siblings, and they did not have the economical resources to engage in academics the same way that other students might have been able to continue through. And so things like that, think about ways that socioeconomic statuses impacts our students' access to resources, their scheduling, their availability, their parents' scheduling and availability, and how that impacts their day-to-day living. Additionally, educational history. So what is their parents' education level? How familiar are their parents with education? Do they default to teachers as kind of the authority on topics and really support their students in just, what happens at school is what happens at school versus how much can they support at home, things like that. Also, the students' general knowledge of school expectations, their study skills, their test-taking skills, these are all very much culturally impacted. And then another topic to consider is the cultural importance of education. Is this something where you are told from the since kindergarten that you're going to go to college one day and that is your trajectory? Is it something that we just do? There's no universal response to how parents and families view education. And so that is something to keep in mind as we are assessing students. And this really comes into play a lot with our secondary students as well. What is the value that we place on education? There's not a right or wrong answer, but that is culturally impacted. Next up is language exposure. So how often is this student hearing or using a language, whether that is English, whether that is another language? How often are they using it? How often are they hearing it? That impacts our ability to acquire that language. And in what contexts are they hearing this language? Because there are a lot of words and concepts and information that kids are not going to be exposed to or can miss being exposed to depending on cultural and environmental factors. So let me give you an example of this, but kind of in reverse. So again, during our multicultural assessment course, first year of grad school, I'm sitting in that class, right? And I grew up in a bilingual household. My mom's first language is Spanish. But in moving to Utah, growing up in Utah in a predominantly English speaking community, our kind of dynamic at home was my mom would speak Spanish and we would reply in English. And so there were a lot of gaps in my Spanish vocabulary, which sometimes I wouldn't even realize until they kind of came up in mostly embarrassing contexts. So I'm sitting in multicultural assessment, a first year graduate student, and my professor asks me how to say this word in Spanish. And I was mortified because I had no idea. I had never been in a situation where I had to learn this word in Spanish, the word aunt. I didn't know, but I knew that it is a very basic vocabulary word that kids probably learn, by the time they're 5. I knew that, and I was embarrassed by that. But also, I had never had an opportunity to learn this word. I just never did. And I also never recognized that that was a gap in my vocabulary until this very moment, right? And so that is something to keep in mind too when we are working with students who have a linguistically diverse background, right? So for me, this is because I was fluent in English, because I was fluent in the predominant language. This didn't impact me academically beyond just being embarrassed, right? But if you flip that, if I was learning to speak English and you're assessing my English proficiency based on being able to say the word aunt, well, you know, you could look at that and say, oh, she doesn't know how to say that word. She's, you know, doesn't know English. But in reality, it's just a gap in vocabulary acquisition that can happen based on the exposure to these words, the exposure to these concepts and this information that comes with just general life language exposure. So something to keep in mind as you're assessing students. It's really easy as we're going through our assessment practices and we're, you know, getting close to our ceiling and we're saying, oh, look, they don't know this vocabulary word. They don't know this vocabulary word. They don't know this vocabulary word. We're done. Okay. However, there is a possibility that we just hit a gap in their repertoire, right? And so how can we explore this further if we have a clear picture of the student's background? Well, one of those things to consider too is maybe I don't know the name of this little bug, but I know it's a bug and I know that it builds hills out of dirt and I can explain to you what it is. I just don't know the name. And so I'm demonstrating that while I am lacking, yes, the vocabulary knowledge, I still have some additional knowledge on this topic that shouldn't be dismissed because I don't know the word aunt. So keep in mind, how can language exposure create gaps in our acquisition of language and our vocabulary based on how often we're hearing and using the language and in what contexts? Okay, other things to consider that are cultural and environmental factors. So something else is the relative value status of the language in society. So are we in a societal culture that values speaking other languages? There are some cultures that absolutely do. And there are some situations where we see lots of videos of people being incredibly discriminatory against people speaking other languages. And students pick up on that. And those dynamics also exist within our K through 12 schools, where you can have students that are very afraid of being bullied for speaking their other language, or for trying to speak English and having a significant accent. And so we have to be aware of how do these societal dynamics impact the acquisition of language too, and impact these students who are trying to learn English in whether they want to practice out loud, whether they are distancing themselves from their native language, things like that. Additionally, things like speech and communication considerations is, do certain sounds exist, or certain sounds from English exist in their native language? So I recently was working with a student whose family immigrated from China and speak Mandarin. And in working with my speech pathologist, because I am providing a lot of English language support in developing in language exposure and support in that regard. And so I wanted to be really conscientious of this idea. So I was collaborating with my speech language pathologist to see if she was aware too of, you know, what sounds in English do not exist in Mandarin. And there are some, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are differences in the way that we pronounce sounds. There are sounds that exist in other languages that don't exist in English. There are letters in other alphabets that don't exist in English, and vice versa. So how can we be aware of that and not view that as a deficit, but rather as a cultural difference? Okay. Lastly, as far as cultural environmental factors, we want to be really aware of parent perceptions of social concerns, behavior concerns, adaptive skills versus teacher perceptions of those same skills. because there can be significant cultural differences in these areas. Specifically in functional communication, does the child come from a culture in which it is considered acceptable to, I don't know, speak out in class, be really loud and participate in whole group responses? How do they feel about approaching the teacher for help? How, things like that. How does culture impact this? And it can be really complicated because there's, again, no universal answer. This changes from culture to culture. This changes across, from one city to another city in the same country, in the same state. And so there are a lot of nuances here. And of course, we can't account for everything, but we do want to be aware, how is this child individually impacted by these factors? Other things to consider are peer and adult relationships. So are the way that they are playing and talking and engaging with their peers or with adults appropriate to and culturally relevant? How are we taking that into consideration as we are evaluating these behaviors? Other things, adaptive skills. So I can give you a questionnaire about adaptive skills, but they are very much based on the kind of dominant culture in the United States, which is very much based on white Western culture, right? And so that's kind of the standard for a lot of the ways we are approaching evaluating these issues. And that can really sometimes either over exaggerate the amount of concerns that we're seeing or under, right? And so we want to really take that into consideration. And then lastly, our questionnaire is available in other languages. If I am trying to give parents a questionnaire to evaluate their child's behavior through an through a general special education evaluation, am I being culturally sensitive in that I can provide these materials in the language that they are most comfortable using? For reference, the Basque, the Connors, off the top of my head, are available in multiple languages. And so be mindful of the tools that you are using in this area to support, parents feeling involved and able to fully and equitably participate in the assessment process. All righty. So I am assuming that some of you have heard this acronym before, WEIRD. And this is referring to the majority of participants in research studies and psychological research studies. And it is essentially saying that the majority of these participants are white, they are well educated, they are from industrialized countries, they are likely rich and wealthy, and democratic countries. And so this culture really impacts the lens through which we have assessment measures, the lens through which we view research. This impacts how we conceptualize different disabilities, because this is the standard individual that those are based off of. And so sometimes that can result in us under-identifying or over-identifying students from other racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds because they do not fit this mold that most of these studies and most of these models are based on. And so just be really conscious of the ways that that pops up. How has this become the default? How has this become the expectation to which we are comparing? In the classroom, in meetings, in any dynamics that we have, how is this become the measuring stick against which our students are being compared? Okay, so moving forward, let's talk a little bit about language dominance versus language proficiency. And the big takeaway here is that these are not the same thing. I can prefer one language and still not be proficient in that language. So what we're seeing here with language dominance is this is relative. This could be referred to as your language preference. So I prefer to speak in English, maybe because of some of those factors we discussed earlier. Maybe it's more comfortable for me because there are more students speaking English at school. It makes me feel less embarrassed. It makes me feel more accepted. For whatever reason, language dominance, the language that the child uses more commonly. Language proficiency is an actual measure of how well someone can read, listen, write, speak the language compared to their peers. And so language proficiency is really essential in determining the most appropriate assessment tools to use in conducting evaluations. Because I can prefer to speak in English, but if I'm not proficient in English, I'm more proficient in my native language, then it is more appropriate and more accurate to assess me in that language. So just keep in mind that there is a difference here. Just because, you're talking to a parent and they say, hey, my child actually prefers to speak English, it doesn't necessarily mean that their child is proficient in English. So there's that to keep in mind. So how do we assess language proficiency? There are a few different tools. And so there's something called the WIDA that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It is a really big program that is found in the majority of the states in the United States. And this is, at least in districts here in Utah, this is given to every single student whose parents report another language being spoken at home. So this is like just a data point that we have right off the bat for students who have been identified as multilingual learners. So this is kind of just exists regardless of whether we are evaluating these students for special education. So we can use this to inform whether we refer a student for evaluation, what kind of supports that student needs at the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 levels. This is just a data point that we are given off the bat. So once we refer students to special education and we do see, oh, they have a WIDA score of 2, that tells me that their English proficiency is pretty low. I'm going to want to provide some additional assessment to further evaluate their English proficiency. And so these are a couple of examples here that I have listed. The bilingual verbal ability test, the BVAT. And what this does is it assesses CALP in English only. And so this gives us a score, a reference for their English proficiency. However, this doesn't provide the information if their native language is stronger, if they're more proficient in their native language. That doesn't tell us what their proficiency score there is. It just tells us in English. So other assessments that are that can provide that information: the Woodcock-Johnson Test of Oral Language and the Woodcock-Munoz Language Survey. So these assess CALP in English and Spanish. So as far as I'm aware, these are pretty strictly for Spanish. Spanish is the most commonly spoken language in Utah outside of English. So this is what you'll likely run into most often. And this gives us a good idea of their CALP in both English and in Spanish. So we can compare those things. And again, this isn't referring to language dominance. This is referring to language proficiency, and specifically their academic language proficiency. You and I can speak conversationally in Spanish just fine, but if you ask me to translate a very academic document, a very, technical, that kind of technical language, I can't do it, right? I don't have those skills because my exposure to Spanish was very conversational, was very informal. And so this is specifically assessing academic language, which is essential to, perform in academic spaces. So this gives us a good idea of that. All right, now let's talk about cognitive assessments. So there are some differences in nonverbal assessments and nonverbal indices on otherwise verbal assessments. Okay, so here's some examples up here on this top row. The Unit 2, the Wechsler Nonverbal Scale of Ability, the Leiter 3. These are what we call nonverbal assessments. They can be delivered without saying a word, right? They are designed to be administered strictly with visual cues, with gestural prompts, to completely eliminate the need for language and for any of that cultural loading, that crystallized intelligence piece. We're removing that entirely because that is very loaded with cultural knowledge. Okay, so we're removing that piece entirely. And so this is a really great option for when we are needing to do a cognitive assessment on a student who doesn't speak English or who does not have very high English proficiency. Also used for students that generally struggle with verbal language. That could be students on the autism spectrum, anything like that. So that's what this can really support. Now, we also have other assessments like the KABC, like the WISC-5, that also have a nonverbal index. And so what this is essentially doing is looking at these subtests available within the cognitive battery that don't require a verbal response. And so we're essentially taking away that expressive language component. However, instructions for these tasks, while they can be supplemented by gestural prompts and visual cues, we're still giving verbal instructions, right? And so I've seen, and we'll talk about an example case like this, where we're giving the WISC-5 and we're seeing a really, really low score in verbal comprehension. So let's also report the nonverbal index. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if we're going into choosing an assessment tool, knowing that there are communication language concerns prior, we can right off the bat provide a more equitable assessment by utilizing one of these nonverbal assessment tools. Okay. Something else to really keep in mind here. I remember sitting in a human intelligence class in my undergrad as one of 3 ethnic minority students in the class, and listening to the professor talk about how, racial and ethnic differences in IQ scores. And he presented this information as if this is just non-negotiable facts, that there are these inherent intelligence differences between races. And again, as one of very few students in that class who were who were ethnic and racial minority students, I was incredibly uncomfortable. And I walked away from that class wondering if I even wanted to go into this field, if this is how people would view me, if this is how my colleagues would view me. I was really, really frustrated. And so in further looking into this topic, we have to be aware of the fact that different tests produce different score differences, right? And so if we look up here at this table we can see that the mean score differences by race across various cognitive tests. So if we look at the Stanford Binet 4, their normative sample, we are seeing a almost 13-point difference across races, a mean score difference of nearly 13 points, which is, looking at standard scores, just short of a standard deviation. That is a huge difference that can really undermine our culturally diverse students, that we have to keep in mind these differences and how they vary by test, right? Because if I'm going to use the Stanford Binet on a racially diverse student, I have to be aware that I am potentially setting them up to have a significantly lower score than their white peers, also compared to what they might be performing on a different assessment. So other scores up here that are pretty significant. The WISC-5 normative sample, we're seeing a difference of about 11.6, so almost 12 points. This is something to be really aware of, because this tends to be a go-to assessment in a lot of districts, in a lot of training programs, that, oh, yep, we'll just do the WISC every time. We're going to do the WISC every time. It's just an easy, I have it on my iPad. I don't have to request materials. That's my go-to assessment. But again, keep in mind, how is that impacting and inaccurately reflecting on the cognitive abilities of my culturally diverse students? Am I potentially setting them up for an inaccurate representation of their cognitive ability because we have these racial differences in scores, a mean score difference of almost 12 points? Okay. Compare that then to KABC, we see a difference of about 7 points, the CAS2, a difference about 6.3 points. The KABC2, when they did matched samples, which is a little bit different, you can look into that on your own if you're interested in this topic. The difference in score is about 5. So there are assessments that are considered more appropriate and, more culturally responsive than some of our standard go-tos. That's not to say our standard go-tos are wrong or bad, but that we have to be really cognizant of the fact that and the ways that these impact our racially diverse students. So there's that. I know that the first time I saw this, I was pretty, pretty shook up. I was pretty concerned about the fact that how often had I just jumped to using the whisk? How often did I just, have this standard procedure that I would run through and not consider the way that that impacts and my students? So just moving forward, be aware of the ways that we can provide equitable assessment practices, and that is considering how these score differences across assessment tools can impact our students. Okay, so I want to talk really briefly about an example case. So scores have been changed just a little bit for confidentiality, but very similar discrepancies here, just to kind of get the idea. So let me tell you about a kid that I inherited from another district. 3rd grade Latino student, we had a score of 1.9. That's saying that his English proficiency is really low. And then they did the whisk, and these are the scores that I got. So verbal comprehension, 65. Full scale IQ score, 74. Nonverbal index, 83. So I could look at this and I could say, oh, well, look at his English proficiency. It's really low. Verbal comprehension, super low. Nonverbal index, we see higher than our full scale IQ. Okay, so we're just going to attribute all of this to him being an ML student. And the reason I bring up this case specifically is because I gave you a lot of information that can be really scary and make it seem like, oh my goodness, I have to be just attribute everything to cultural differences, attribute everything to these statistical differences. But as we interpret results, we have to be really aware of the whole picture, okay? So if I look at this case with just this information, it would be very easy to dismiss the student as saying, okay, this isn't a kid with a disability. This is just a kid who needs more English language exposure. Okay, that is my face value. That's my interpretation. However, there's more to the picture, okay? This student's parents report that they do primarily speak English in the home. And when the student communicates, he is English language dominant. So he does not have a lot of Spanish language exposure at home or in the community or in the school that is primarily English speaking. Okay, so suddenly that changes things a little bit, because we're not seeing a lack of English exposure. This child is being exposed to a lot of English and has been for several years. He was born in the United States. He's been exposed to English since childhood. Parents are both fluent in English. Okay, there's something else going on. We have our speech language pathologist dive in, and we see his receptive and expressive language is really low. All right, this is a little bit different of a presentation. This is not just a kid who lacks English exposure. This is a kid who does have a disability in communication. Okay, so I really would encourage you, as you are going through your own cases and you are going through your own experiences, to look at this through a very wide lens. Okay, don't become so hung up on not over-identifying ML students for special education that you start to under-identify, or vice versa. There are students who are multilingual learners, who are culturally diverse, who do have disabilities, and you are doing them a disservice by disregarding those concerns as just cultural differences, as just a lack of English proficiency. But on the flip side, if a child has not received adequate tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 support, if that is not a reason to send them through to special education, right? It's a nuanced issue, as it is for all of our kids. There's just a little extra added nuance here with these students. And so really look at these cases as a whole case, these children as whole children with unique backgrounds, with unique circumstances, with their own cultural impacts and cultural preferences and cultural traditions and environmental factors and all of those things that play in together to determine what is most appropriate in assessing this child and what is most appropriate in interpreting their results, which then leads us into providing services. So that's really what I wanted to focus on today. That's really what I would like to send home as your takeaway today from this presentation is, what are some of the extra factors that I need to consider in viewing this child and this case as a very comprehensive evaluation? So with that, we're ending a little bit early, but I'd love to open it up to discussion and anything else that you've noticed or cases that you've come across in evaluation. And so if anyone would like to share, or if anyone has questions, I would love to hear from you. And feel free to turn your camera on if you feel comfortable. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Ashley, yeah, I'm the social worker for the lab. So one of the other things that I don't know, I consider when I look into a different culture and everything is the way they behave as well. Like when they feel more comfortable with one of the languages, their behavior and the way they interact with others will be completely different. If they feel more comfortable in English, they're going to be more outgoing. Maybe they are going to be able to talk more and hang out with more people. But if they are not comfortable with English, is going to be completely opposite, right? They are going to be more shy and things like that. I think behaviorally, it really create an impact on the student as well. So I really like your presentation because it look at different points and it doesn't show the, having a second language is part of a disability, because it used to be viewed like that. Basically, oh, he's late, he has a disability or something. We're going to put all of those kids in one classroom and try to teach them the language because they're slow, but they didn't look deeper into what is going on related to other things around the environment and other things. So thank you so much for the presentation. It was great. And this is going to be crazy, but I'm going to say that also the not having enough psychologists bilingual is because of the system, basically. And doing those tests, like you said, targeting gaps in diverse group of psychologists or social workers that can pass their exams, because they are targeting that gap that is between a person that is native speaking, native speaker in English and a person that is speaking another language. So that is another issue. That is why we don't have enough people in the schools.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you bringing up that point. It is so true. And especially where we have so many students that come from diverse backgrounds that are the first person in their family to go to college or to go to graduate school, navigating that system in and of itself is so difficult. And so by putting up these just unnecessary hurdles, we're keeping people out of these programs and out of these fields. And that is really just impacting across the board, our students, our potential psychologists, our potential social workers, and who can provide those supports. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks to you.
All righty. Well, thank you. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for a wonderful presentation. Our group kind of just whittled down a little small group today, but really appreciate you coming out here to talk about such an important topic. One virtual round of applause for Ashley for her presentation today. We'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. This presentation is recorded and will be published to the UTech Lab website as well as YouTube channel. You can go to the UTech Lab website by going to u-tteclab.com, and you can find information on previous webinars as well as upcoming ones as well. Again, thank you so much for presenting and for attending, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.